Dear guests, our next panel is entitled A Game Changer for the Global Power Shifts. For the keynote speech, I would like to invite Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Professor Kudret Özersay. Dear guests, our next panel is entitled A Game Changer for the Global Power Shifts. For the keynote speech, I would like to invite Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister of Foreign Affairs, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, Professor Kudret Özersay. Mr. Özersay, floor is yours.
Thank you. Many thanks to the Presidency of the Republic of Turkey for this organization and international cooperation platform. Regarding the role and function of energy as a regional cooperation actor, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean region, I will try to draw a kind of a framework which may be helpful for those who are going to make the presentation and discuss, like Matthew. Well, very briefly, in normal circumstances, cooperation in a region can generate interdependence, and that's really important for the regional peace and stability, that's for sure. Because if the relevant actors feel and see that any conflict or confrontation there, because of the interdependence, may cause a cost for the actor, most probably they will prefer not to go into that conflict. Therefore, interdependence is very important for the regional peace and stability. In normal circumstances, for any type of cooperation, particularly the regional cooperation, I believe that you need mainly three elements. The first element is the need to have a kind of a willingness to cooperate among relevant actors. It may either exist because of the mutual need or mutual interest, the willingness to cooperate, or it may exist, that willingness may exist because of the conditions compelling that actor to cooperate. That compelling situation or conditions may be created through a leverage that may be utilized by the relevant actors. The second element, I believe, for the cooperation, particularly in a region, is that you need something to cooperate. Well, it may be either defense cooperation or cooperation in the field of tourism or cooperation in the field of energy. So you need something to cooperate. Of course, these two elements are for ideal cooperation, and we can isolate potential cooperation from the distinctive, we cannot isolate the cooperation from the distinctive features of that specific region. For a cooperation to exist in a region, we have to think about the distinctive features, the characteristics of that region as well. Let's take Eastern Mediterranean as an example. It may be more difficult to cooperate in this region, in Eastern Mediterranean, because of the absence of mutual recognition among potential actors who would cooperate. For example, the state of Palestine not recognizing Israel, the state of Israel, and vice versa. For example, Arab countries not recognizing Israel, except Egypt. Egypt has relations with Israel. Like the Greek Cypriot administered Cyprus not recognizing Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, TRNC, and vice versa, TRNC not recognizing Greek Cypriot administered Cyprus, and Turkey not recognizing Greek Cypriot administered Cyprus, and vice versa, and this continues for the Eastern Mediterranean region. In these circumstances, you may need one more element for regional cooperation as the third element, I believe. And this is pragmatic approaches, practical approaches. Now, in the light of these three elements, let me briefly give you a concrete example of cooperation, regional cooperation, that took place in 2011 in Cyprus. In 2011, there was a serious explosion in the Greek Cypriot side, the Mari event, which caused the collapse of the electricity system and the electricity generation power plant, and which also caused the collapse of the small shops, damaged the frozen fish, ice cream, and everything in the market, in the Greek Cypriot side, because there was no electricity at all following the 2011 explosion. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is that at that time, in the Greek Cypriot side, in South Cyprus in 2011, there was an imminent need to cooperate, to get electricity. Therefore, we had the first of the two elements of cooperation. One was mutual need, or the mutual interest to use the electricity or buy electricity from North Cyprus. And the second one was that we had something to cooperate, which was electricity, which is mainly energy. But that is really important, or was really important, because at that time, in 2011, the Greek Cypriot side was hesitant in buying electricity from the north. And the main reason of that hesitation was that, well, the electricity body or the institution in the north is a public authority. Therefore, the Greek Cypriot side does not recognize TRNC. If they buy electricity from the north from a public body or public authority of electricity authority, it may cause a kind of recognition. Therefore, they were hesitant to buy the electricity. We could have insisted, as the Turkish Cypriot side, on selling electricity via the electricity body or public board. However, we followed a pragmatic approach, and we showed some flexibility, and we decided to sell the electricity via the Turkish Cypriot Chamber of Commerce to the Greek Cypriot side, and the Greek Cypriot side bought the electricity from the north as if a Greek Cypriot person is going to use the electricity. So there was a personal bank account of a Greek Cypriot, whereas the money was transferred from there to the north, to the Turkish Cypriot Chamber of Commerce, and from the Turkish Cypriot Chamber of Commerce to the electricity board of the Turkish Cypriot side, acting on behalf of the TRNC, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So a pragmatic approach was followed. Therefore, a perfect example of regional cooperation on energy took place even before the comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus problem in the island. Now, there is a kind of interconnected electricity system in Cyprus between north and south, and that is there, standby. If and when there is a need, either in the Greek Cypriot side or in the Turkish Cypriot side, we can sell or buy electricity from each other. Now there's an established and institutionalized cooperation between North and South. Now, of course, there are other types of regional cooperation which may not necessarily help or serve the regional peace and stability. For example, if you cooperate against another actor in the region, for example, in order to beat the other, that may not be that helpful cooperation for the peace. This may not help the regional peace, of course, and we, as the Turkish Cypriot side, and I myself, as the foreign minister of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, can say that we consider, for example, the most recent Greek Cypriot administered Cyprus's move to create regional cooperation platform with Israel, Greece, and Egypt, we perceive it a kind of cooperation that took place against us, or designed in a way to beat the arguments of Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots. So in that sense, I would like to ask one main question and complete my speech. Is it possible to have a cooperation on hydrocarbon resources in Eastern Mediterranean before the comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus problem? My answer to this is that in these circumstances, it is not easy, but still possible. It's worth to think about and work on, I believe, because comprehensive settlement in Cyprus, unfortunately, is not that close to us, and there is a long way to that point still. Not that I like it, but because I'm realistic. Let's have a look what can be done about the energy cooperation in Eastern Mediterranean region in the light of these three elements. First, we have something to cooperate, that's for sure. It has been identified. Natural gas, and no one is questioning the fact that these natural gas resources belong to both communities, and there are disputed areas, and Turkey has her own rights in her own maritime zones. Therefore, there is something to cooperate, that's for sure, as the first element. Second, that's the missing element, I believe, willingness to cooperate. Now, this is defined as a missing element because the Greek Cypriot side lives in a comfort zone. This is my assessment, of course, in the sense that even if there is no comprehensive settlement, it is possible for the Greek Cypriot side to enjoy and utilize these resources. Even if they don't get the consent of the Turkish Cypriots, it is still possible for them to use those resources. Even if they don't sit and negotiate with the Turkish Cypriots, they are able to utilize these resources. I'm not criticizing the Greek Cypriot side for that, because if I put myself into their shoes, I wouldn't do something different. I mean, if I'm recognized as the legal government of the whole island, as the Greek Cypriot side now has, or if I'm accepted to the European Union without a comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus problem, or if I'm giving the opportunity to utilize all these resources without getting the consent of the Turkish Cypriots, who are the co-owners of these resources, I wouldn't share it with the Turkish Cypriots, with the Greek Cypriots, most probably. Therefore, not to criticize the Greek Cypriot side, but to see the comfort zone of the Greek Cypriot side in this sense causes absence of the willingness to cooperate, basically. Now, there is absence of such need to cooperate in the Greek Cypriot side, and we need a different approach in order for that willingness to be created, in my view. And that new approach should be the conditionality approach, which is not something new for the European Union. In the European Union, there is such a principle of conditionality, particularly for the case of membership process, whereas they put certain conditions. If you satisfy those conditions, you move forward and you become a full member. Now, if at one point, either the international community or a specific state or a specific company put a condition to the Greek Cypriot side and say that, well, up until now we followed a specific process and we reached to the point of drilling, but from now onwards, at the moment of monetizing, for example, those resources, for us to move forward, you have to get the consent of the Turkish Cypriots. You don't need to resolve the Cyprus problem because we know that it's been more than 50 years now since the beginning of the negotiations, but you can get the consent of the Turkish Cypriots, or you can sit and discuss and negotiate with them and cooperate with them. If you cooperate, we will be able to move forward on this matter. If this type of a conditionality is developed there will be a kind of a willingness to cooperate in the region, which is very important. And I'm very confident in saying that because in 2004, we missed an opportunity. In the case of EU membership process, it could have been made conditional to the settlement of the Cyprus problem or conditional to the yes vote of the Greek Cypriot side in the referenda. They didn't do that. And now the Greek Cypriots are in the European Union without a comprehensive settlement. We shall not continue unless you get the consent of the Turkish Cypriots or sit and discuss with them or agree with them. Why? This can even be said by a company because of the liability risk that is waiting for that company. If we are talking about the two co-owners of the same resource, and if a company is going to invest in that area without getting one of the consent of one of the co-owners, it may end up with a kind of liability problem. Therefore, this can be an excuse for that company to start using the conditionality approach towards the Greek Cypriot side. As I mentioned at the beginning today, that need may exist either because of the mutual interest or because of the compelling circumstances which may be created through the leverage. Therefore, I think either a leverage has to be used by the international community like this, or a leverage will be used by Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot side through drilling, for example, or through the parallel activities in the field of natural resources by putting that pressure or compelling the Greek Cypriot side to cooperate with us, because the cooperation on that matter is our priority. Now, how about the third element then? Let's assume for the sake of argument that Greek Cypriot side has the willingness to cooperate with us. What will be the pragmatic approach on this matter? How that cooperation is going to take place in the region? I believe that there are different options for that. For example, a bicommunal committee can take, and that committee can be used as a platform to do that, because currently there are such committees and there is no problem of acknowledging the other side. Or all regional actors, including Turkey, Israel, and others, State of Palestine, can get together at a conference, not an academic conference, just like the conference which took place in Crans-Montana, whereas the Greek Cypriots did not have any problem to be in the same meeting with Turkey and vice versa and the Turkish Cypriots, a kind of an international conference in order to achieve a kind of cooperation in the region with the participation of all relevant actors. Another option, via the companies. For example, the parties can authorize the companies, and the companies can get together and negotiate on behalf of the parties and make some contracts on behalf of the parties. Or via the company, a company can make parallel contracts with the conflicting parties, the same company. In the case of ExxonMobil, who has a partnership with Qatar Petroleum, just like they did a contract with the Greek Cypriot side, they can have another contract with the Turkish Cypriots as well, because we are talking about the source belonging to both communities. So there are different ways of satisfying the third element, which is necessary for the cooperation in the region. It is worth to think about it, and mainly the responsibility, I believe, relies on the international community to take certain steps to create the necessary elements of cooperation in the region, particularly where we are discussing the absence of willingness to share power and prosperity, where we have a difficulty to create comprehensive settlement in Cyprus. I believe that while waiting that or working for that, in the meantime, even before the comprehensive settlement, there is a room to create the environment to cooperate in this region. It's up to us and up to the other actors of the international community. Thank you.
Sayın Başbakan, sizi sahneye davet edelim tekrardan. May I kindly invite Mr. Mithat Rende, former ambassador, to present a plaque of honor to our distinguished speaker. Sayın Özersay'a plaket takdimimiz gerçekleşiyor Mithat Rende tarafından. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz kendisine konuşmasına. Dear guests, our panel is entitled A Game Changer for the Global Power Shifts. Now I would like to invite our moderator and the panelists to take their seats. The moderator for this panel is Mithat Rende, former ambassador to Doha, Turkey, and the panelists are Bryza, ambassador, U.S.A, Çağatay Erciyes, former ambassador, Stanic, founder and chairperson of EALaw.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. His Excellency Kudret Özersay, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of TRNC, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. We welcome your presence, sir, and we thank you so much for a very stimulating remarks and speech. It made our panel even more relevant. Thank you so much. I have two distinguished speakers today with me, His Excellency Bryza, a prominent diplomat, the former ambassador of the United States to Baku, and also we have a distinguished lawyer, Ms. Stanic from the United Kingdom, the chairman, founder, and chairperson of EALaw. So we will unfortunately, we don't have much time. Maybe, hopefully, we will have an hour to discuss also a few pertinent issues regarding also the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean and the relevance of energy in general. Unfortunately, dear friends, Ambassador Çağatay Erciyes, who is the Director General for Maritime and Aviation Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he couldn't make it as he was instructed to travel to London to attend an International Maritime Organization meeting. So, and he kindly asked me to also, in his absence, to offer a Turkish perspective. So I will start maybe with the permission of my friends and speakers. First of all, I think we should recall that energy is the engine of growth and development, and it has been so important for the last 50, 60 years especially, but nowadays it's becoming all the more important, and it's the driving force of growth, and it has been, therefore it has been so high on the international agenda. Energy security, we talk about energy security, it's directly linked to our foreign policies, to our defense and security policies. Therefore, it was always important, but recently it became even more important. Controlling and protecting energy infrastructure, energy resources, and choke points are becoming even also more important. And they have been a priority for major powers. You all know that power struggle is the order of the day among major powers, among regional powers, power struggle over the energy and especially hydrocarbon resources, and also certain regions. A case in point is the Middle East, dear friends, and North Africa. And you may agree with me that many prime ministers and presidents have been unseated, they have been destroyed, killed because of the fact that they were controlling energy resources. Now, today we're talking about energy transition. It's an important development, energy transition towards renewables. We will have more renewables in our energy basket. And the reason is simple. Everybody is talking about climate change, about air pollution, but basically climate change. And why it's so important? Because 82% of the CO2 emissions, they originate from the energy resources. So energy resources are the source of CO2 emissions, and this is why the world in general is going towards decarbonization. So we have a decarbonization process, and this is an important development. We feel the heat, especially countries like Turkey who are still burning coal and hydrocarbon resources. They feel the heat, and they will definitely, in the long run, will be switching to renewables and low carbon emissions. So having said this, I think we should return now to Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, in this, why the Eastern Mediterranean has become so important during the last 10 to 15 years? Because natural gas is now the transition energy, and the Eastern Med is rich in natural gas. According to the recent studies, probably the potential of the Eastern Mediterranean is between 6.5 to 9.5 trillion cubic meters. And this is an important figure. And of course, especially our Israeli friends managed to discover gas about 10 years ago. And we were quite delighted to hear the good news. And we started negotiating with the Israelis, Turkey, engaged in negotiations, the private sector. And we thought that Turkey would be the right and the best market for Israeli gas. But then, given the strained relations, unfortunately, we couldn't reach any results so far. But probably in the future, we hope that something could be done. Now, as regards the energy resources beyond Israel, and especially in the offshore of Cyprus, here as the foreign minister of the RNC, Mr. Özersay put it properly and rightly, here we have conflicting interests. We have, probably we should also recall that in Cyprus it's a divided island, let's face it. We have co-owners of the islands are the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. They are the co-founders and the co-owners of the island. And therefore, the Greek Cypriots do not represent, in law or de facto, in fact, the Turkish Cypriots or the island as a whole. So if they do not legally represent the whole island, they should not be in a position to conclude international agreements on behalf of the Turkish Cypriots. While the situation compels us to talk to the compels them to talk to the Turkish Cypriots, they unfortunately unilaterally declared their so-called exclusive economic zones. The Greek Cypriots unilaterally concluded delimitation agreements with Egypt, with Israel, and with Lebanon. So they went alone, and despite all the calls and demarches by the Turkish side, the Turkish Cypriots, they did not engage with the Turkish Cypriots regarding the unilateral, these actions in order to explore gas. What they did was to also unilaterally declare concession blocks. So they declared their blocks and they granted licenses. And also in 2011, I believe that they also discovered gas. And then in 2011, the Turkish Cypriots approached again the Greek Cypriot side, the Greek Cypriot administration, and asked them to establish a joint committee to jointly explore and exploit the natural resources of the island, and they were turned down. So the Turkish side had to act then unilaterally, and then they concluded a continental shelf agreement with Turkey, and then they declared their own continental shelf, and they declared their own concession blocks, and they granted licenses to TPA, or the Turkish Petroleum Company, to drill and explore gas and oil, and therefore Turkey started deep sea drilling there in the offshore of Cyprus. So this is the situation. So by the way, Turkey also in 2004 declared its continental shelf and registered it with the United Nations. So what we have here, and I hope that we can have Ms. Stanic has a very nice map. We were asked to, could we get the map of the Eastern Mediterranean? Probably. Okay, in the absence of this map, anyway, what I wanted to say is that we have at present around Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, we have there is overlapping maritime jurisdiction areas and disputed claims. And in this case, when you have overlapping, according to international law, when you have overlapping maritime jurisdiction areas, yes. Now I can see it. If we have overlapping maritime jurisdiction areas and disputed claims, the only way to deal with this is through negotiations and to conclude agreements. So in order to conclude agreements, you need to recognize the other side as a sovereign entity. And the foreign minister rightly said that the Greek Cypriots administration, they do not recognize the Turkish side. The Turkish side does not recognize the Greek Cypriots. Turkey, we don't recognize as a sovereign entity the Greek side. So what we hope is to have a comprehensive settlement in Cyprus, after which we will have a new republic, and then Turkey will be in a position to negotiate with the new republic, where the Turkish sides will be also fairly and properly represented. So the situation it's quite complicated. So we have overlapping areas and claims between Turkey and the Greek Cypriots, and also between Turkey and Greece, between the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. So it's quite complicated, but there's a window of opportunity offered by the foreign minister, and it's very creative. Your Excellency, I was delighted to hear the proposal that the resources, the rich resources, should be a source of cooperation, not a source of conflict. So I hope that they can be creative, and that through private companies and enterprises that we can reach, or they can reach an agreement, so that they could utilize and tap the resources. Because if you strike gas, it is an important development. When you discover gas, it's important. But then what you need is the right environment to spend billions of dollars to build the infrastructure. You need to build the platforms and then the pipelines which are necessary. And also you need to find the market, because if you go to international institutions and ask for funds, first of all, they will ask you whether you have a long-term agreement with the potential buyers or not. And therefore, it's quite important to have the political will to cooperate. But personally, I'm not that hopeful about the political will of the Greek side, the Greek Cypriots, because so far my experience suggests that they have been negotiating with the Turkish side, the Turkish Cypriots. They pursue the process-oriented negotiation tactic. So they're not interested in a result, in a quick result. They are interested in the process. So they continue under the UN pressure and under the pressure from the international community. They continue to negotiate with the Turkish side, but they're not result-oriented negotiations. So this is why I'm not that hopeful. And also, as regards the attitude of the European Union, unfortunately, the European Union, dear friends, they made a historic mistake by giving full membership to the Greek Cypriot administration in the absence of a comprehensive settlement. It was a mistake, and they seem to continue making mistakes. Now they are taking sides, and it's in such, this is a legal matter. It's a very sensitive issue when you have overlapping claims and jurisdiction, maritime jurisdiction areas. You need to remain neutral and try to be on the right side of history and try to add to efforts to make the two sides engage in meaningful cooperation. So far, the European Union is exerting pressure, political pressure, on the Turkish side and also on Turkey, and threatening with sanctions, which is not well received by Turkey and the Turkish people. So therefore, I hope that the European Union, I hope common sense will prevail and that they will refrain from continuing with their political pressure on Turkey because if Turkey would just accept to stop deep sea drilling activities, it would mean an implicit recognition of the arguments provided by the Greek Cypriot side. So I hope that Turkey will continue drilling with its drilling activities, and then we have the capacity to do so, and in the end, maybe other players will come to agree to engage in cooperation with the Turkish side and the Turkish Cypriots. So having said this, I think I should like to give the floor to now Ms. Anna Stanic because she has a flight to catch. And you have the floor, madam.
Can we get the slides up, please? Okay, so thank you, Mithat, for inviting me, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me here to speak to you today. What we see here is a map, as Mithat told you, of the overlapping claims. In fact, the map is more complicated than this, if you want to make it accurate. But what I want to really talk about is really, let's see if I can move it. What I want to talk about really is to what extent international law, and I'm convinced of that, and I think the title of this entire conference of the New World Order fits within the concept of the international law playing a very important part in that. And I think with respect to the conflict in the East Mediterranean, international law will play an important part. In fact, all the actors in the East Mediterranean are referring to international law when they make their claims. So it is within that context that the discussion will need to take place. And so what I propose to do today is give you a whistleblow tour of international law, hopefully clearly enough, so that you can see that we actually have the tools for an agreement to be reached within the law as it stands today. So these are the 5 topics that I will talk about. And I will also talk about the law on the laying of pipelines, because Mithat had told me that just a few days ago there has been an announcement of a gas and potentially electricity line being built to connect TRNC with Turkey. So I'll talk about that law as well. So let's first talk about what rights states have in international law with respect to maritime zones. And here, I guess the most important thing to remember is that Turkey is not a signatory to the Law of the Sea Convention. So though I will refer here to articles of that convention, I'm referring to them because I think there's little debate in Turkey as well that these provisions that I will be referring to are considered customary international law. There are some other provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention that Turkey does not consider bound by, but I'm not touching those. So for the purposes of simplicity, I will equate the Law of the Sea Convention to the customary international law for the time being. And I think the most important thing I want to emphasize from this slide is the difference in the nature of the jurisdiction that a state has in its territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles from shore, and what it has in the exclusive economic zone or the continental shelf. So when we talk about the rights that states have in the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf, we're talking about sovereign rights. We're not talking about sovereignty. And the importance of that is that actually in the law, in international law, the rights, the sovereign rights are exhaustively listed. So unlike on land or in territorial sea where the jurisdiction of the state is whatever the state decides it is, in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf, they are actually enumerated. And one of the most important rights, and the one that is here in discussion, is the right to drill. Of course, right to drill in your territory, and then to the extent that that's disputed, there is an international dispute. So you can see the rights there, and you can see that the rights also extend beyond exploration and exploitation of natural resources to also jurisdiction, and here the word jurisdiction is used for marine scientific research and protection and preservation of the environment. Now, what happens then when you have two sets of states that claim to have the continental shelves or overlapping exclusive economic zones or territorial seas? And here I think it is correct to say that there are different principles that apply to how you delimit then those overlapping jurisdictions. And with respect to territorial seas, I think there is no doubt that equidistance is the principle that you use as the overriding principle for delimitation. The difference is that with respect to exclusive economic zones and continental shelves, the overriding principle is not equidistance. Actually, the overriding principle is achieving an equitable solution. And it is actually in those words that we can see that international law actually gives an opportunity for an actual agreement to be reached, because an agreement will only be reached and the international law will impose it provided the parties submit it to a dispute resolution when that will achieve an equitable solution. Now, how does one come to what is an equitable solution? We have the experience or the case law of the International Court of Justice and other tribunals that have delimited many, many disputes around the world. East Mediterranean is not unique in having maritime disputes. These are there's over 400 outstanding delimitation disputes around the world. So East Med is not unique and therefore is capable of achieving an agreement as they have elsewhere. But there are steps, and you can see that the first step is to actually draw the equidistance line. And then the second step is to actually look at factors and circumstances which would need to that line being adjusted. And here issues of islands or the length of a coastal state will be relevant. And finally, there's a final check, step 3, which is the proportionality step. And there specifically, for example, concerns that Turkey might have as a country with an extremely long coastal coast, that aspect, that specific aspect of its concern is something that would be dealt with specifically with respect to step 3. And here we don't have enough time, but if I think you are able to get the slides from the organizers of the conference, but I have discussed here within the various steps what are the different issues that would become relevant, specifically for East Med with respect to islands, rocks, low tide elevations, and so on, and also with respect to step 2. Now, what I want to do is go to the next point, and that is the aspect that concerns the current drilling or the plans to drill, both from the side of Cyprus and Turkey. And here, again, going back to what I said with the principles of international law, and that is that a state has an exclusive right to authorize drilling in its territorial sea on its continental shelf. The question obviously becomes what happens when there is a dispute as to the territory in which those gas reserves belong. And I think the best thing that we can say in terms of international law about what it could impose is to impose an obligation on the states to try to cooperate to reach an agreement. So I don't think there is an obligation on the states to reach an agreement, but there's certainly an obligation to, in good faith, negotiate an agreement. And arguably, in the absence of such an agreement, that there's an obligation to exercise restraint in exercising the rights to unilaterally explore straddling reserves. Now, there is this obligation to try to reach a provisional arrangement is also set out in the Law of the Sea Convention. But I think the most important thing I want to emphasize here is that in situations similar to the East Mediterranean, where there's been an intractable situation, there have been successful tools that have been used to overcome, at least provisionally, the situation. And joint development zones is one of those, where precisely as the foreign minister has said, there's an attempt, particularly led by corporations, to develop a particular zone. And that is done by the two sides actually agreeing to specifically develop that zone without that development, or without that agreement predetermining the actual maritime boundary. So it's a provisional arrangement which actually allows for joint development of a zone. Other possibilities, and we've discussed it with Bryza in the past, is sui generis agreements, which actually provide for, again, a specific framework for a specific thing, like a pipeline, which then, again, does not prejudge the delimitation. Looking at the international law rules on laying of pipelines, here again, it's very important to know that, and this is not a contention aspect of the Law of the Sea Convention, and that is that all states, not just the coastal states, not just the states in dispute, but all states are entitled to lay submarine cables and pipelines on the continental shelves or the exclusive economic zones of other states. And there's only limited ways in which that right can be impeded. And these are, some of these things you probably know from the Nord Stream 2 discussions about the implications of these specific provisions. But really, the ability of the state, of the coastal state, is only to influence the course of the pipeline, or to say that there are environmental issues that need to be considered as the pipeline is being laid. But otherwise, the right is there for anyone to lay the pipeline. Now, finally, let me just briefly set out what I think are the mechanisms that are available there for resolving the disputes. And here, we need to remember that the states, and that includes all states in the East Mediterranean, have an obligation pursuant to the United Nations Charter, to which they've all signed up to, and that is to resolve the disputes peacefully. And that is a fundamental obligation that all states have. And they also have an obligation to refrain from threat or use of force in trying to resolve the disputes, or trying to act in a way that affects the territorial integrity of another state. Now, given the fact that Turkey and some of the other countries in the East Mediterranean are not signatory to the Law of the Sea Convention, then from the point of view, as we are here in Turkey, of what ways Turkey can look at resolving these disputes, there are two in terms of a binding mechanism of resolving disputes by a third party neutral. And those would be going to the International Court of Justice by way of a special agreement, so that, for example, Greece and Turkey would need to agree to delimit or to give the jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice to resolve that dispute, or alternatively to go to arbitration. Now, you might think this is far-fetched and this is unlikely to happen, but countries like Slovenia and Croatia have done so. So have Norway and the United Kingdom at a time back in the 1930s, when there was actually looking like there would be war over fisheries. So there are many precedents that can be followed, and so I don't think this pie in the sky, and I think this is a reality that we will face hopefully very soon. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you. It's quite an academic presentation. And now, Ambassador Bryza has the floor. Matt, please.
Thank you, Excellency. Dear Mithat, those were 3 brilliant presentations, and so much so that I'm throwing mine out, or at least reversing it and condensing it, because all the points I wanted to make have been made. Deputy Prime Minister Özersay, that was one of the most intellectually exciting and creative proposals regarding the Cyprus situation that I've ever heard, and it comes from a sitting official. And I would like to follow up with anybody, but with you, with your team at some point, because I've been writing about some of those and thinking about the very same issues, and together with you for some years, especially on electricity sharing and the opportunity that provides to become a very strong confidence building measure. Short of a settlement, in fact, that could help get to a settlement by changing the mood. And usually when I write or talk about this, everybody else's eyes glaze over, they're just totally bored, but this really excited me. Mithat Bey, you laid out for us the injustice of what has happened with regard to Turkish rights, economic rights, and Turkish Cypriot rights to partake in the decision-making process of any significant national decision involving Cyprus. That's in the Treaties of Guarantee of 1960. That concept is fundamentally part of the Republic of Cyprus Constitution, and that's been violated since the early 1960s when one side decided the other side could no longer serve in government or be a member of the parliament. So if you change the rules, if you don't abide by the Constitution, there's no will to reach an equitable solution. And if you then get to derive all the leverage by virtue of entering the European Union, at which point you have the full force of EU law and EU political solidarity of member states behind you, there is no incentive, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, no incentive for one side to compromise and to show the goodwill that Anna, you were just talking about, and to fulfill the international legal obligation to negotiate in a spirit of searching for an equitable solution. And you were so clear. Nobody articulates these concepts clearer that I know. So where there's a will, there's a way. There was a will in the case of the electricity sharing, but as we saw in Crans-Montana, it's pretty clear to me that the Turkish side was willing to make some historic compromises. And I wasn't there, but I think I know what happened. I won't go into the details because I think what the Turkish side was willing to do was so groundbreaking that it would maybe pose a political liability for the people who are doing the negotiating. Yet the Greek Cypriot side decided to reject that. To me, it was a huge disappointment because Greek Cypriot President Anastasiades was the Greek Cypriot leader who more than anyone supported the Annan Plan in 2004. I at the time was working in the White House for President Bush. Cyprus was part of my portfolio, as was Turkey, the Caucasus, blah, blah, blah. And we really thought that the will and the reputation of Anastasiades would be enough to convince the Greek Cypriot population to vote in favor of the Annan Plan in their referendum after the Turkish Cypriot side had. They chose to vote no, got their membership, and got all the legal leverage. So coming up with additional forms of leverage, as he talked about, like drilling for hydrocarbons west and east of the island by the Turkish Petroleum Company. That perspective is very different from the way the Turkish TPIO's actions are played up in the United States and in Europe, where they are seen as simply a hostile action by a Turkish government that is difficult to comprehend, that seems to be drifting away from NATO, or so the narrative goes, and that is trying to do harm to the Kurds in northern Syria, rather than focusing on the reality that in northern Syria, the United States was partnering with a terrorist organization. So getting to arbitration or an international conference to work through these issues is probably, for now, today, it's a bridge too far because of the severe turbulence and negativity in Turkey's relations with the United States and Europe, which I think we see two parallel narratives about many factors in Washington and Turkey, but about Syria, about the coup attempt in 2016, and that's poisoned the atmosphere. But other things can happen, other things should begin with, I think, electricity sharing. And let me wrap up with a few thoughts about the first question that we were posed in the context of my own government, the United States. I'm no longer an official. The question is, what is the role of energy in geopolitics? And I think, I think my answer, based on my experience with the United States, will surprise you. I think conventional wisdom, at least about the United States, when it comes to energy, especially hydrocarbons, is that is what drives U.S. foreign policy, right? People assume, let's take the case of Iraq. The reason the United States liberated or invaded Iraq was to get control of the oil. And even President Trump has been saying, with regard to Syria today, right, the residual U.S. troop presence in Syria is to control the oil. My experience, and I was in the White House for the whole planning of the Iraq War and its execution. My project was to convince Turkey to say yes to our request to invade Iraq via Turkey. I failed miserably, almost succeeded, but we failed. But my experience sitting through those planning meetings was that controlling the oil did not come up. Controlling the oil did not come up. What was happening in the minds of my big bosses was that I think President Bush really wanted to, quote unquote, finish the job in Iraq that his father had started in the first Gulf War and depose Saddam Hussein, and was looking for reasons to do it. But more thoughtfully and more strategically, there was a sense when President Bush came into office of where are the biggest threats to American national security? They're in the Middle East. What form do they take? Weapons of mass destruction, getting into the wrong hands. Who has them? Saddam Hussein does, or at least did, and we don't know where they are, despite the fiasco in the United Nations Security Council. I know from the meetings I sat in that the US military planners really expected chemical weapons to be used on date X. And in the plan, there was the need to move the chemical protective suits to the troops on day Y, before that would happen. So they genuinely thought this chemical weapons could be used. So the idea was we need strategically to take a step to prevent someone who we think has these weapons from getting them in the hands of, let's say, non-state actors in a way that could be the most destabilizing event in world history. That's the big idea that drove US policy. You may not believe me, but look at what happened in the aftermath. What happened in the aftermath was not that US oil companies got control of all Iraqi oil. There is one US oil company currently operating in Iraq. It happens to be, in federal Iraq, not in Kurdish region of Iraq. That's ExxonMobil. But Exxon has been at loggerheads with the Iraqi government because ExxonMobil is also developing a major field in northern Iraq, in the Iraqi Kurdish region. So ExxonMobil simply went out and negotiated, not with help by the United States, and in fact, companies from countries that the United States is not friendly with, like from Russia, were able to get concessions in Iraq as well. So oil was an important factor in Iraq because it generated the wealth of Saddam's regime, and oil was important to other actors, but controlling that oil was not a US goal. And similarly in Syria, the US doesn't need the oil in Syria. The US is the world's largest oil and natural gas producer today, the largest in the world. What the US is trying to do, I think, is number one, prevent that oil from falling into the hand, or the wealth of that oil from falling into the hands of the so-called Islamic State or Daesh. And I think President Trump's inner sanctum of advisors were struggling to find some excuse, some pretext to convince President Trump to keep some US soldiers on the ground in Syria. And they know he understands, in general, business and oil, and so they said, let's control the oil. But not with any interest in their own in that happening. They simply wanted to find a way to convince the US president not to pull out from Syria completely, because doing so will create an even bigger strategic vacuum in Syria. So finally, my last remark, turning to my dear friend Mithat, has to do with what Deputy Prime Minister was talking about, which is the will to use energy to cooperate, the will, and having something there with which to do it. Our governments had a great history of doing that in the case of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline and the South Caucasus gas pipeline, which bring large quantities of hydrocarbons from now primarily from Azerbaijan to Turkey and then onward to European markets. We decided in the then Clinton administration to support, it wasn't our idea, we were supporting the ideas of Turkey and Georgia and Azerbaijan. Not for U.S. companies' sake, not to control those fields. In fact, there's no U.S. company who's producing natural gas in Azerbaijan. And Exxon and Chevron do use the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline, but the only American company originally in the consortium that brought the oil out of the ground in Azerbaijan no longer exists. It's Amoco, which is now part of BP. So the U.S. deep strategic partnership with Turkey on that project, BTC, was based on a strategic ambition of fostering cooperation among those three states, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, helping them, especially Azerbaijan and Georgia, secure their independence, their energy independence, and then make sure the largest discovery of oil since, let's say, the North Slope of Alaska, which is the new oil found in the Caspian Sea, can make it to global markets unimpeded by geographic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Turkish Straits, and free from monopolistic pressure of the Russian pipeline system and Russian hydrocarbon producers. So that was an example of where energy brought countries together, to the detriment of Armenia, granted, but that's a whole other set of issues. But what's happening now in the Eastern Mediterranean is that hydrocarbon discoveries are being used to divide, to isolate Turkey, though at the same time to bring together Egypt and Israel, which is another big strategic goal of the United States. So I think the most important thing to happen now is to get U.S.-Turkey relations back on track, so that then, together, we can be using these various creative and hard-nosed mechanisms that are available if the goodwill is there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Dirmat, and thank you for being straightforward. Yes, coming back to ExxonMobil and their discovery of gas off the coast of Cyprus, you're right that there have been many efforts to isolate Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also it's comforting to see that the main players came to understand that Turkey is the market for any gas to be exploited in East Med. In fact, initially they tried to devise other strategies and pipelines and so on, but they found out that in order to spend billions of dollars and build platforms and pipelines and so on, you need a project to be bankable, environmentally sustainable, and economically feasible. And they concluded that they have to sell gas, including the Israelis. The gas market will be Turkey and beyond, and through Turkey maybe to Europe, because otherwise it won't be economically feasible. And this is why I heard, and I hope it's true, that ExxonMobil people, they are planning to maybe, if they decide to invest in the East Med, they would like to tie back other resources such as Leviathan and maybe Aphrodites and other gas fields, and hopefully the gas fields that will be discovered by Turkey. Some people suggest that Turkey has already discovered some volumes, but they keep it quiet, so you never know. But anyway, the best solution would be in the Eastern Mediterranean is cooperation, and I see with great pleasure through our Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mr. Kudret Özersay, that there is a political will on the part of the Turkish Cypriots, that you rightly said that if there is a will, there is a way. And I hope that the other side will be also creative, and we need, if we discovered gas, and maybe in the long run, maybe oil also in the East Med, we need to find the market. The market is Turkey, and through Turkey, Europe, and I hope that we can reach a common understanding on the exploitation of these resources, and maybe then we can reach some political compromises with a view to reaching a comprehensive settlement to the Cyprus issue. Thank you so much. Anna, would you like to have any, I know that you have a plane to catch, but would you like to add any point. Thank you so much. And please go ahead, Matt.
Very briefly would like to follow up on what you were just saying. I think that, I mean, full disclosure, I'm on the board of a Turkish energy company called Turkas, which is, thanks to that, I got to know Anna and got to work again with Ambassador Rende. So what we were trying to do was to build a consortium of Turkish companies that would buy the gas produced in Israel's Leviathan natural gas field. And as Ambassador Rende said, there were very detailed negotiations going on. And I would call back to you, by the way, in the middle of those to see if this sounded like it was workable. It got to the point of us negotiating the natural gas pricing formula. So how would you connect the price of natural gas in Turkey with the international trading hubs, in this case, in the UK? I don't need to go into the details, but this was a highly complex formula that was trying to share all the commercial benefits of rising or falling natural gas prices in Europe equitably. So we went a long way down that path. Ultimately, it didn't work out, I think, because Turkey and Israel didn't fully normalize their relations, so you can't build a pipeline from a gas field in one country that really doesn't have diplomatic relations with the buying country. And then finally, we also had the problem of the territorial disputes that Anna was talking about. And very creatively, you did come up with some concepts that are quite workable when the mood is right. What we were doing as companies, though, was trying another way to get over the need somehow to gain the Greek Cypriot authorities' consent. Now, as Anna explained, a state does not have the, and correct me if I'm wrong, a state does not have the right to block a pipeline from crossing its continental shelf, but it can object and withhold its consent on environmental grounds or safety grounds. And if the Greek Cypriot authorities did that, it would make it probably quite difficult to secure financing, certainly from commercial banks, and it would turn the pipeline, if the Israeli side and Turkish side just built it across the Greek Cypriot continental shelf without consent, it would turn the pipeline into a divisive issue, so it kind of loses its political significance. But from a commercial perspective, what we were proposing is take advantage of the fact that the same two companies, Israel's Delek Drilling and the U.S. Noble Energy, were developing both the Leviathan field, leading the development in Israel, and the Aphrodite field in the Greek Cypriot area. Why not negotiate an agreement behind closed doors that then gets international support through intergovernmental agreements, could be brokered by the EU or the US or whomever, that says that it's okay for the pipeline to be built because the gas is ready to go from Israel. There's not enough gas in Cypriot waters to justify either a pipeline or a liquid natural gas facility. So let that exploration for natural gas continue in Greek Cypriot waters. Don't hold up the pipeline. In fact, build the pipeline and then pledge some of the early revenues from those gas sales in the only logical market, Turkey. Pledge those somehow to help the Greek Cypriots realize their energy infrastructure goal. At that time, it was a liquid natural gas facility in Vasilikos. And cover that all. Give political cover to the leaders of all entities with an intergovernmental agreement. And I have to say, there was interest by both Noble and Delek Drilling, but for political reasons, it all fell apart. But that's another example of where there's a will, there's a way, and companies can and should participate in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Please, Helen.
Just maybe a comment on that, because the logic of that we talked about at the time with respect to the pipeline applies then is the same to drilling, and it really is what I was talking about earlier about the joint development zones, because that's exactly what the purpose of those are. And that's how they are developed. In fact, if we go back to the North Sea as an example, and how the oil reserves were developed, exploited there, was precisely that. Norway and UK were at the rock bottom of their relations at the time that they discovered that there was oil. And they started off by agreeing with respect to specific fields how to apportion share the resources there, and by bringing in the various companies therefore to get involved. And over time, we have now come to the arrangement that there is now that actually covers the whole thing. So it was specific fields that were developed over time into a more comprehensive arrangement. And it's that kind of step-by-step approach that joint development zones allow you to do to make those steps. And I think I agree entirely with everything that's been said so far in respect to the idea that these kind of initiatives will primarily need to be company-led because they require that kind of out-of-the-box thinking. And just to give you an example, I was involved in a similar kind of a discussion in Africa, where a specific company, a large company, was looking to develop a specific field, which was argued to belong to both countries that were in dispute. They had a license from one of them, but obviously not from the other. And they were quite nervous about the idea of going ahead. And as one of the ways in which they started talking about it, and when I was brought in to try to find a way for them to develop the resource, was to actually say, well, we will put some monies in an escrow agreement. We will estimate which proportion of the field is arguably belongs to the other country, and we will at the very least do that, keep the money aside. That then prompted the other country to step in and find a way to give them the license on the other side, and that therefore there was a solution in which way that was false. So there are many creative things that can be explored, and as I say, I do think they will end up being led by companies themselves.
Thank you so much, and in the interest of time, I think we should just complete here our discussion. Thank you for your patience and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator and the panelists for their thought-provoking discussions. May I kindly now invite founder of International Cooperation Platform to present a plaque of honor to our distinguished moderator and the panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on with the next panel, entitled Challenges Faced by the European Union. We're not going to have a coffee break. Değerli misafirler, kahve molası vermeyeceğiz. Devam ediyoruz programımıza. Bir sonraki panelimizle. Değerli misafirler, lütfen yerlerimizi alalım. Panelimiz başlamak üzere. Dear guests, may I kindly ask you to take your seats, please? Our panel is about to start. Dear guests, our next panel is entitled Challenges Faced by the European Union. Değerli konuklar, panelimiz başlamak üzeredir. Lütfen yerlerimizi alalım. Dear guests, may I kindly ask you to take your seats, please? Our panel is about to start. Değerli konuklar, panelimiz başlamak üzeredir. Lütfen yerlerimizi alalım. Dear guests, may I kindly ask you to take your seats? Our panel is about to start. Değerli konuklar, keynote konuşmacımız geldiler. For the keynote speech, our keynote speaker has just arrived. Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly ask you to take your seats? Dear guests, let me introduce you our keynote speaker for this panel. I would like to invite Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Turkey, Faruk Kaymakçı, for his speech. Siz